everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are on this planet. It's 3 p.m. UTC, 4 p.m. Central European Time, and that means that we are ready to embark on this new webinar for the first one for this year, and it's a webinar all about our TMS FNC Memo, a new component in the FNC family that was recently released that we are going to have a look at. If everything with respect to audio and video is clear, please give me a short message in the chat box. Then I know that everything is received well on your side and we can proceed with this webinar today. And I hear a confirmation that everything on the other side is okay. So let's go and explore the wonderful world of this new TMS FNC Memo control. So what was actually the idea, the mission behind the development of this component? It was our mission to bring the extensive power and feature set of what you can do in the Visual Studio Code editor to make that functionality available to your Delphi applications. And that's what it is going to be all about in this webinar today. So this is the overview, what we plan to discuss today in this webinar. So first of all, for those not familiar with Visual Studio Code, we are going to have a brief look at it. It is not to be confused with Microsoft Visual Studio. We are talking here about Visual Studio Code, also from Microsoft, but clearly it is a different product, different software from Microsoft Visual Studio. We'll cover what FNC Memo specifically is and where it can be used and what kind of features and functionality is available. We are also going to touch the architecture of the FNC Memo, and then the major part of this webinar will be showing all kinds of capabilities, but also technical things about FNC Memo with code examples. And we'll finish this webinar with a roadmap for next versions of the FNC Memo. So first of all, let's briefly discuss what Visual Studio Code is. I looked up this description of Visual Studio Code at several sources, and one of these sources was the InfoWorld, and saying that Visual Studio Code is a free, lightweight, but powerful source code editor that runs on the desktop and on web. And it is available for Windows, macOS, and Linux, and also Raspberry Pi. So it's a cross-platform code editor that you can run everywhere, and that also supports, features a lot of languages for which it performs syntax highlighting. Another source of information was here on ZDNet that gives us an insight in the number of users for Visual Studio Code. ZDNet talks about 14 million users. There are different number of sources on the amount of users, but I think it can clearly be said that millions of software developers use Visual Studio Code. We also see here references to GitHub, Electron, Chromium, JavaScript, and a Microsoft JavaScript superset TypeScript. We are going to cover how and what exactly from this Visual Studio Code experience we expose for your Delphi applications, but for sure, Electron is out of the scope. That is, of course, not used. Chromium is not really used per se either, but of course it is based on a JavaScript library, but more details about that shortly. And finally, I also asked Chat GPT if Chat GPT could tell me something about Visual Studio Code. We ask these days everything to Chat GPT, I guess. And so this is the answer that Chat GPT came up with. Basically, I would say the same as the articles from journalists. It is a source code editor with millions of users that is cross-platform. I think that with that, the most important thing about Visual Studio Code is covered. Also, not forgetting that it is open source, so it is free to use by everyone, as opposed to the other product, which is Microsoft Visual Studio. That's clearly not an open source or free product. And so our goal was, given this very, very successful project, to surface this proven technology for you Delphi developers, to add that part, that syntax highlighting code editor, in your Delphi applications. If there is a need in your application to display code of all kinds in better ways, with syntax highlighting, code completion, and all these kind of things. So instead of reinventing the wheel, we are just trying to make good use of something existing and something powerful. And here is a brief overview of the result of surfacing this Visual Studio Code editor. So we bring a syntax highlighting code editor for your Delphi applications. It features or has built-in code completion support, IntelliSense support. It can optionally show a code map. You can use indicators for breakpoints and bookmarks. You can use find and replace functions in a couple of ways. It also features theming. We have built-in support for light and dark theme. And by bringing this code editor to Delphi, it can be used in VCL Windows applications, in cross-platform FireMonkey applications. That means applications running on Windows, Mac, Linux, but also iOS and Android. And also from the Lazarus IDE, you can use our FNC Memo. And when you create web client applications with Delphi with TMS WebCore, the FNC Memo is also usable from there. So I think you can target pretty much every operating system or web browser with the FNC Memo. And on top of that, you can also use it from multiple IDEs. You can use it from the Delphi IDE. You can also use it from C++ Builder. It integrates into Lazarus, so also usable there in LCL applications. And finally, we have TMS WebCore also running in Visual Studio Code. And this component is also available as a component for Visual Studio Code. I would say that kind of makes the circle round. Let's briefly go over the main features. So obviously there is some support for code completion, and that is applicable to multiple languages. So there are a lot of programming languages supported from the Visual Studio Code IDE, and these are also surfaced, exposed in our FNC Memo components. We'll have a look at that in a moment. The interface to set breakpoints and bookmarks in the gutter. And as you can see on the right side of this screenshot, there is also this optional code map that gives you a quick overview of the code and allows you to browse quickly through it. As I said, the themes, there's a light and a dark theme. For those who favor dark themes, with a switch of a property, the code editor will run in with a dark background, and that can bring peace to your eyes. has built-in find and replace options. What you can see here is the built-in options, but we have also added an interface so you can steer the find and replace functionality from application level code in Delphi with native dialogues for performing find and replace. Let's briefly discuss the architecture of this component, because making a component this way is slightly different from, let's say, building a regular VCL control or a regular FireMonkey control. Here we actually built the control around a browser engine, and within this browser engine we are running a JavaScript library. In this case, for the FNC Memo, it is the Monaco JavaScript library, and the Monaco JavaScript library is exactly the same library that is running inside Visual Studio Code. We rely on the operating system browser, so the browser that is standard built into the operating system. That means that there are nothing extra to install, no Edge Chromium or whatsoever to deploy. We take directly advantage of what is already on the operating system, a modern operating system, of course. And on Windows, this relies on the Edge Chromium engine that replaced for quite a while now the Internet Explorer engine. On macOS, it will be using the Safari browser engine, and on Linux, the WebKit engine. As this editor runs as a JavaScript library into this browser engine, of course, we will want to interface bidirectionally between the world of the browser engine where the JavaScript is running and our native Delphi application. And in a bidirectional way, that means that we have implemented a bridge that allows that from your Delphi code, JavaScript functions within this library are being called and interacted with. And in the same way, it is possible out from the JavaScript code to call into Delphi code. For example, an obvious example here is when from the JavaScript code you want to trigger a Delphi event of the component. So that's basically the technique underlying used to expose this Visual Studio Code editor for your native Delphi applications. The JavaScript libraries, the Monaco libraries, can be either directly pulled from a web repository. That means that you need an internet connection when you choose this option to make the application run. This brings the advantage that you're sure that the library is always up to date. And it also reduces the weight of your application. On the other side, with a single property switch, it is also possible to load the Monaco JavaScript libraries from local resources. And that means that in that case, you can fully use the FNC Memo without any internet connection. Fortunately, the Monaco JavaScript library is MIT licensed, so it's an open source MIT license. That means that there are no restrictions for commercial use, so you can use the Monaco editor in any type of applications. The repository from where we get this JavaScript library is found here at the URLs mentioned. And actually, this architecture is not that new. It's actually an architecture that we pioneered here at TMS Software, I think over 10 years ago, with our first component, WebG Maps, that used this technique where the Google Maps JavaScript library was used within an Internet Explorer engine to make it possible to see Google Maps and control the behavior of Google Maps from in the first place, VCL Windows applications. And later on, we also used the same techniques, the same architecture, but with modern browser engines and targeting multiple frameworks and multiple operating systems with FNC Maps. So FNC Maps will be using the Edge Chromium engine on Windows. It will use Safari on macOS and WebKit on Linux to offer you all the features and capabilities of Google Maps, but not only Google Maps. It's a kind of mapping component on steroids. It also offers OpenStreetMaps, Bing Maps, Azure Maps, Mapbox, and a couple of more. And meanwhile, we have also applied this technology in the WX component set. And the target for the WX FNC components is to expose JavaScript libraries for your Delphi applications, that JavaScript libraries with functionality that's not obvious to find for Delphi, that is a kind of rare or hard to find, and with the WX technology, it allows you to take advantage of that. So first of all, let's explore the component, the FNC Memo component from the IDE. And we'll have a look at the properties, events, and methods. Take also in account that there is full online documentation. We actually moved all our FNC component documentation meanwhile online. So for your convenience, the latest version of the documentation is always just a click away in the browser with the online documentation. So let's move to our Delphi IDE. And let's first explore this FNC Memo component. I'll start with a VCL Windows application. And I have installed the FNC UI pack as the memo is part of the TMS FNC UI pack. A memo is a UI control, so that was a kind of logical place where we could add this FNC memo control. So here you have it on the form. A little bit different from regular controls is that you can drag it here from the top. This is the area where you can drag this control, because the other part is responsive, so you can directly use the memo even at design time in the IDE. Let's have a look at the main components, the main properties for this FNC Memo component. And to start with, we have the adapt to style. So that means that the theme of the component will automatically adapt to your system theme, dark or light theme. And the first important property that we encounter going over it in the object inspector is the completion list, which is a list of completion items. And so from here, you can fill yourself custom completion items. So if a couple of letters are typed, the editor will automatically bring it up and suggest to complete it. And it has different properties from where you can control what type of completion this is. For example, also insert just one line of text, multiple words, etc., for a word that it will be completed. So it offers many different options for building your custom completion list. Next, we have as a special property the language property. And from the language property, it allows you to select what kind of highlighting to apply. And as you can see here, it offers a wide range of different programming languages, as we are all Delphi developers, it's kind of obvious that the default value is the language Pascal. But as you can see, it has also highlighting, for example, for SQL, for JavaScript, for C#, TypeScript, XML. So plenty of languages to choose from here in this language property. Another important property is the library location. Remember that I mentioned in the previous slides that the JavaScript library could either be built from an online resource from the web, and with the setting online, that means that here in this case, it will build the settings from the URLs where it is hosted. If I switch this property to offline, that means that it will use the JavaScript libraries embedded in local resources. Here we have the lines property, which is a t-string list type. And this offers you to set code also at design time. And it works actually, it was modeled actually to work identical to a regular T-Memo control, either in VCL or in FNX. Further, we encounter the options property, and under the options property, there are different settings to customize the behavior of your FNC memo. So to quickly go over these, you can see that from here you can control block selection, for example, that allows you to select in columnar style in the memo. You can either have the standard context menu on or off, and if you put it off, you can replace it with the native context menu. It features drag and drop that you can enable or disable. Code folding is also possible and enabled with these options. Glyph margin, that is, you can see a slight jump in the gutter area when you need extra space, for example, to indicate bookmarks or breakpoints. That is what you can do. Or you can, of course, turn off all line numbers and glyph margin to have the smallest area possible for your gutter. You can tell it to show hyperlinks or not. The minimap is what you see here on the right side of this memo. The minimap is by default enabled. So it is enabled standard. If you turn it off, this minimap disappears, but it is automatically managed and generated and by default on. And there are a few properties to customize how it looks and feels and behaves. Mouse wheel can be turned on and off. Overview ruler lanes, these are these vertical lines that indicate start and end of code blocks. So for quick navigation and quick views of code blocks, the overview ruler lanes are their standard set to 3. That means that you will see that it will 3 hierarchical levels of code blocks deep visualize with these ruler lanes. What else do we have? Selection, so you can have that selection rounded or not. And there is also a possibility. Where can I find this property? It's not immediately visualizing here at design time, but there's also a possibility that the line where you edit is indicated or visualized via a rectangular area, so you can easily see where your caret is positioned. And the tab size, also something typically used in software development, standard at 2, but depending on your language, you can configure different tab sizes. And the other properties are more or less what you expect from a memo, like a read-only control, some parent-related settings, and here you have the theme setting, where you can switch between different settings. By default, it is the light style, the default light Visual Studio Code style. So that's a brief overview of the properties. When we look at the events, you can see here different events, but one here events that are related to a drag and drop. If you want to programmatically override or interact with drag and drop, events related to the gutter and clicking on the gutter or clicking in the glyph margin area of the gutter with these events. There's also an event for custom code completion that we will cover in a moment, in a demo, in a sample, with the on-get code completion that allows you to dynamically complete code. And in terms of methods, we'll encounter different methods in the samples that I've prepared for this webinar. But first of all, let's have a look at the performance of the FNC Memo. Obviously, as this is architectured somewhat different than a standard native control, I think it is important to be aware of let's say the pros and cons of this approach, and I've prepared some samples with which we can have a look at the behavior, the performance of the FNC Memo. And first of all, what I prepared is some demos that give you an insight into the effect of using a browser engine to host the memo control. And so what I did here, I have 4 examples. One example with the VCL standard VCL-T memo control, and one with the FNC memo control, and then one with the standard FMX memo, and one with the FNC memo. Basically, what we do is the following: to have a kind of rough measurement of the impact. I have here in the form show. In the form show, I have measurement of the time difference between before the form creation and at the moment the form show event is triggered. So that means that the form is ready, loaded, and ready to be shown. And so here I have this variable in the unit, the variable t. This variable is set from the component, from the application source. So here is where it is initialized before the application, or let's say the form, the main form in this application starts running. Here I capture the time, and then we calculate the time difference till the form is actually active, shown on the screen. So let's first have a look at a standard memo. Obviously, you will notice that this starts very fast. After all, this is Delphi, so it's fast. And so you can see that the time impact for launching a single form in an application is like, let's say, roughly 100 milliseconds. And I have exactly the same for a form that has instead the FNC memo on it. And here we have exactly the same event handler in form show. So in the caption we set, actually we do it in 2 phases. The first phase is when the form is ready to be shown. And here we also show it what the time is for the second phase. And the second phase is when the browser engine has fully loaded and is ready to start working. We captured this from the onInitialized event in the FNC Memo control. That event is triggered when everything is up and running and ready to be used. So let's inspect that behavior. And obviously, as we have to start the browser engine here, this will have an impact. And the purpose of this demo is to show you that impact. So what you can see here is first it was around 2 seconds impact for starting this browser engine, and till it was ready, it's like 5 seconds. This experience will differ as when you have, for example, already started, loaded or loaded the libraries necessary for the browser engine. That of course will reduce. So the first time you have the biggest impact, the second time things are already loaded and have less impact. Let's compare this with the case in FireMonkey. Same approach, FireMonkey application, timing between application start and the readiness of the first main form. And what we see here is that in FireMonkey, in this case, it takes already 3 seconds to show the first form, 3000 milliseconds. And let's compare that with FNC. So this is a FireMonkey application where we dropped an FNC memo on it. Same approach within the form show. Capturing the time, and let's see what kind of numbers we get here. And here we can see that it is not that much different in a FireMonkey application. So from 3 seconds we go to 5 seconds. A small nuance here to make is that the software to host this webinar has an impact on the overall machine performance. So when you are not giving a webinar, expect better results. The main purpose of this demo was to show that indeed you need to take in account at least some additional startup time for your applications when you use this approach to host controls, but it's a one-time hit. If you use this the second time or multiple instances, this hit is reduced. Let's now compare the performance of the memo itself. And also here I have 2 examples. So I have a FireMonkey example, and basically what we have here is a tab control, but I will start with the VCL application. So what we have is a page control. On the first tab sheet we have the FNC memo. On the second tab sheet we have a regular VCL memo, and we load some fixed code. And what I have used here is loading the Pascal file for our grid code, because that is a quite large Pascal file, and we actually measure the time it takes to load this from file. So we get the time before and we show in the label the time after the loading has completed, and we do that both for the FNC memo and the regular VCL memo. So you have an insight in the performance difference between these two. Let's start with our FNC memo, and I press load, and here you can see that this file, let's have a look at how many lines this file is. You can see 67,000 lines, and these were loaded in 900 milliseconds, so still below 1 second to load. And take into account, of course, that you have the full syntax, highlighting, minimap experience, everything is there in this FNC memo. Let's now switch to the regular VCL memo and load the exact same file. And you can see here that it even took longer to show this file in a regular VCL-T memo. In short, the message here is that in terms of performance, when using the component, when using large files in this memo component, it is not much different from a VCL regular T memo, but of course it has a huge difference in the feature set. It can do way more than a regular T memo. Let's compare this now in FireMonkey, the FireMonkey framework, with exactly the same setup. A page control with an FNC memo tab and a standard FMX memo tab. And we do the same here. It's also the same grid component. And you can see in this FireMonkey application, it took 1.4 seconds to load this huge grid source code. Let's do the same for a regular FireMonkey T memo component. And that is expected. That is also the performance difference you will see when you try this. It's even somewhat slower due to this webinar software, but here you can see that the FNC memo actually performs significantly better than the regular FireMonkey T memo control. And even then, of course, you have so much more features in this FireMonkey control. So that gave you hopefully a good idea of what to expect in terms of performance, affecting somewhat the startup time, but in runtime, in use, even with large files, there is little difference. And in FireMonkey, it's even significantly better. It's an FNC component after all, so it's usable in VCL applications, FireMonkey applications, LCL Lazarus applications, but also from TMS WebCore. So let's have a look at what we can do, what we can expect from this component when it is used in a WebCore application. So here is a WebCore application I created to show this. This is the WebCore application in the Delphi IDE. And this is a very basic application. What do we have here? It's the FNC memo component. And we have a web local text file component. This component is part of WebCore, and it allows you access to local files on your system out of your browser. And so what we do is from this open button, we trigger the open file, or we call the open file method. And when this file is opened in the web, several things are of course asynchronous. And so opening a file is also an asynchronous process. When the file is effectively opened, here we capture in the event on file open, we capture the file name and we fill the content with the content retrieved from the local file. We fill that into the FNC memo. And the same actually is, it's kind of similar for saving to a local file. Here we retrieve the text from the memo into the web local text file. And with the web local text file.save, we can save the changes into the local file. So let's run this application. So here it will generate a web client application running in the browser by transpiling all the code to JavaScript. Everything will run right out of the browser. I bring it in view as it started by default on my other screen. So here you have your browser, your application. When I click open, I can pick, let's say we pick a large file, of course, to show how performant it is. It's ADV memo.plus. That is our VCL native standard syntax highlighting memo, and here the entire source code is opened in the browser, and I can use the minimap to browse through that code. If I make a change to this code, let's, for example, let's actualize the release date. Let's make it January 23, like this, and then we save this. Here it asks us to save these on the local file system. I say yes, and the file is saved. And so that shows you how, with extremely little code, how you can write a web experience for editing all kinds of source code files. That gave you an idea of how the FNC Memo behaves in a WebCore application. And so let's move on to different demos that I further prepared. Other approach from a completely different angle to create an, in this case, a desktop application, a cross-platform desktop application, but with web technology, is by using Miletus. So Miletus is the framework with which you can create cross-platform desktop applications built from web technology. So everything is rendered in a browser, but the Miletus framework allows you to interface with the local system, with the file system, but also with different operating system APIs, which are normally otherwise not usable from a browser, but with the Miletus framework, we made that possible. So here you can see this Miletus application with the FNC Memo on it. We added the Miletus main menu that gives you access to the operating system application menu. And given that Miletus is cross-platform, it will use the Mac system menu on a Mac computer and the Linux menu on a Linux machine. I can actually select the target here. So these are all the targets for a Miletus application. We'll run everything here on Windows. So we use the Windows target. And what we have is the Miletus open dialog, Miletus save dialog. These dialogs allow you to use from a Miletus application, web technology based, still the operating system dialogs. Let's run this application. So now it generates a Windows executable, and the Windows executable hosts this FNC Memo, and we'll use the operating system dialogs for opening and saving a file. So here, from here, I can open. I have here, okay, let's pick some Pascal file. And here it is. Here is our editor in a desktop application in this case, and we can open and save it. The code for that is actually quite simple. Also here, not much rocket science. So from new, obviously we have FNC memo.clear, and we execute the open or save dialog. And when the files are selected from the events triggered on file selection, here we have this open dialog execute. What we do here is capture the file name, and then we create a Miletus string list, which is the string list that gives us access to the local file system. And we load the file in the string list, and then we actually assign it to the lines of the memo. So this allows you to create also cross-platform desktop applications, but from a completely different angle. And let's go a step further and have a look at other possibilities of the FNC Memo, how you can interact with code with your FNC Memo control. And we start off with something very simple. Here I show you how you can programmatically insert text into the memo. And noteworthy here is that we made this interface as close as possible, as compatible, as closable as possible with the regular VCL memo. That means there is this line string list interface that you use exactly the same way, but there is also getting and setting the selection in the memo, for example, where we have exactly the same properties as we have with a VCLT memo. And so let's run this application. And here you can see how you can programmatically interface with the memo control. So you can see text was inserted and selection was set here on the word world. The idea here is that it is as intuitive and familiar as possible with the standard memo controls. And let's have a look now at a first way to work with code completion. The first way is by setting up everything you want to do with code completion from properties at design time. And for that, we use the completion list collection property. And you can see here that I added a couple of items. And here I added some American cities. There is Detroit, San Francisco, Chicago, and New York. And the last completion item, you can also see that the kind of completion here is a text kind. The last item, I made it a function kind. The only difference actually is the symbol or the glyph with which this is shown in the completion dropdown. And this one has a set of text that it will complete. If you look at the Detroit, for example, here, well, there's nothing else set. It will fill in Detroit to complete. If I type, for example, DE, it will complete to Detroit. When I have a look here at this function completion item, you can see here that it will add multiple lines to the memo control. And you can see here dollar signs. And the dollar signs indicate that these are parameters. So you will be able to tap through places where there are similar parameters to fill in the specifics in this code block. Other than the setup of this completion list, I did nothing. No code was added for this demo. And let's have a look at the result of doing this. So here is my memo control. And when I type text, you can see that if I type DE, it will complete to Detroit, San Francisco, New York, or Chicago. And if I want to enter an if block, for example, it completes to this kind of block. And so here I can type my condition with the tab key. I can insert the code in the specific areas where these variables, the dollar variables, are set in my code snippet. So you can build up all kinds of snippets to significantly accelerate typing into this FNC memo. This is setup of completion at design time, but it is also possible to dynamically complete in the FNC memo. And that's what we are going to have a look at now in this demo, where we implement the onGetCompletion list. So in this event, onGetCodeCompletion, what we do here is we can manipulate the completion list. This event passes the token at the caret, so we can use that information to steer how we want to perform the code completion. And so what we do here, actually, that's something that is not needed anymore with the latest release. But what we have is a word list, and I will actually show you the word list. In the code completion folder, we have a simple text file. And so this is a file of like 100,000 English words. And so we, on startup of the application, we have loaded this word list into a string list. And what we do here is from the token, we take the uppercase version, and then we search for all matching words in the word list and feed that into the completion list. And so it will, from the word list, show us in the drop-down all matching words for the token or the part of the text at the caret where we invoke the code completion. So let's have a look at the behavior of this example. So when I type, for example, butter, I can complete this butterfly, for example, or I can complete, you can see all the words that fit with the first letters that I typed into the memo. So this is just one quick example how you can build your own custom lists and feed these dynamically to the completion list. And this brings us to find and replace. So for find and replace, we have standard built-in find and replace capabilities. These capabilities are built in at code editor level, but we can also perform find and replace invoked by Delphi code and steered by Delphi dialogues for find and replace. So here we have the standard find dialog from the VCL and the standard replace dialog. And from here we have, we trigger actually the find dialog and the other button, the replace dialog. And then in the event handlers of the find dialog, in the on find, for example, when the find button is clicked, what we do here is we initialize the options for the find call, so the FNC Memo find call. We initialize these options with the default options, and then we set the match case sensitive find to what was set in the find dialog.options. And we can also steer the direction of the find to be up or down. And we also get that from the dialog and pass this along in the find call as a parameter. And it's pretty much the same thing with replace, for example, where of course we call the memo replace method with the text to be found and the new text to replace. So let's run this example. And first of all, we're going to have a look at what we get built in, let's say for free, that is included by default. So some code was initialized that I have set at design time, and when I press Ctrl F, here we can perform search in Memo, and different options going up, down, etc. are available from this little built-in dialog. The same applies for replace, triggered by Ctrl H. Here I can, from here I can perform my replace functionality that is built in. But I can do actually exactly the same from a dialog, a native dialog in this case. And when I type here public and do a find, you can see that it finds the instances of public. When I do a match case, it will of course only find the all lowercase public in the code. And the same applies to the replace functionality. So you can choose actually how you want to make find and replace available in your Delphi application. Let's move on to drag and drop. The memo also features drag and drop. Built-in, no-code solution to perform drag and drop. It is enabled by a single property, and it allows you to handle drag and drop by dropping files, but also by dropping text onto the memo from another application. And that is technically on Windows performed using only drag and drop. So if I go and see under options, drag and drop is enabled by default. So there is no code to add. And let's run this application. And here, let's move to this folder that has some files from where I can perform the drop. So I pick the ADV memo source code file, drop it on the memo, and it's here ready to be edited. Let's clear everything. And here I have Microsoft Word. And I took the opportunity to mention our upcoming training days on 11 and 12 May in Bruges. But from Word, I can take this text and actually drop it, of course, as plain text here in the FNC Memo control. So both ways of using drag and drop are possible with our FNC Memo control. And as we are approaching the end of our presentation here, let's have a quick look at breakpoints and bookmarks. So here in this little sample, I added some code snippet that shows you how easy it actually is to set in the gutter breakpoints and bookmarks. It's not much more than a Boolean property per line. So this is the line number 5 and 10. So this will set a breakpoint at line 5 and a bookmark at line 10. And by simply toggling a Boolean, that is sufficient. What I also do is handle the click on the gutter, and from there I can toggle a breakpoint in the gutter. And so let's bring up this example. The code snippet is loaded. And so when I click set breakpoint and bookmark, you can see here the red circle, that is the breakpoint, and here the bookmark image. And of course, when I click into the gutter, it will move or add or toggle the breakpoint at the line clicked. What we have not covered yet is the support for URLs. So also that is possible. It will automatically detect that this is an URL. You can see that it is underlined, and there is this small hint from where I can open this, or I can also control click it to open the URL. So URL clicking support is also built into this FNC memo. And that was our round trip for today in the FNC memo control. And let's finish with having a look at the IDs we have for future developments of the FNC memo. You have seen now that I have interfaced with the standard VCL, and the same applies to the FireMonkey Find and Replace dialogues. But we could extend this and bring native dialogues that surface all the specific find and replace features that are included in the FNC memo. We will also explore and work on further UI customization so that you have or can take full control over all things like how the selection color is in the memo, customize your own background color, so how the line numbers are displayed, etc. Surface all these capabilities. Multi-taps, that is also something that we are already working on for a next update. So the idea here is to offer via a single memo, edit multiple sources, so to make this whole approach resource friendly and allowing you, for example, to have 50 files of source code open, but switch them from a single memo so that everything will be very resource friendly. Hiding code areas and making code areas read-only is also on the roadmap. Automatically pick the right language based on the file extension of the files that you load in the memo is also on the roadmap. And of course, as always, we are listening to all your inputs. So let us know via the support center or via email. We are listening. We are very curious to hear what kind of things you want to see coming up in next versions of the TMS FNC memo. And that brings us to the last part, questions and answers. So if there are here users who have questions, then now is the time to address these. First question I see here is, what about the deployment? So the deployment on, that's a different case on different operating systems, of course. On a Windows machine, the only files that might be needed to deploy and which we recommend to deploy, to be sure, that is either a 32-bit DLL to interface with the Edge Chromium browser engine that is by now deployed by Microsoft itself in Windows 10 and Windows 11. So apart from this DLL, there is nothing to extra deploy on a Windows application. The single executable plus this DLL. The DLLs are included in our distributions. On the Mac, there is nothing extra to deploy. You simply compile your application and deploy your application to the Mac, and the same applies to Linux and actually also to iOS and Android. So I hope this answers your question on what files to deploy for these several operating systems. Any other questions that might be coming up? Now is your opportunity. I see for the moment no more questions coming up. But of course, if you explore these components, the fully functional trial version is available, so you can play with it out of all Delphi versions between XC7 and Delphi 11 Alexandria. You can download it from our website and play with it. I see another question coming up. Can it be used together with the scripter? We have not done yet the integration with TMS Scripter as it is available now with our VCL ADV memo component. But with the scripter, it uses a similar technique with an event for custom code completion. As this event is also available in the FNC memo, it actually would come down to porting the code that fills the completion list for the ADV memo to port that to the FNC memo. That should not be that hard, and is also indeed something interesting for future versions of both the scripter and FNC memo, and actually a good idea to bring that. But I think it should also be possible starting from the scripter ADV memo integration to quickly port that to use FNC memo instead. And if there are no further questions coming up, then of course I want to thank you for your time and for your interest, for being here. We'll send the presentation and the code to you by email for everyone who registered for the webinar. And we look forward to encounter you in an upcoming webinar later this month. Thank you, everyone, and we'll keep in touch via email, support center, and I look forward to hear your comments. Have a further great day. Enjoy Delphi coding until the next time.